Welcome to 19 Washington Square North. My name is Kerry Barrett, and I'm the Associate Director of Academic Programs for NYU Abu Dhabi. As some of you may know, NYU Abu Dhabi is the result of a partnership between NYU and Abu Dhabi to create a world-class liberal arts college. And I'm pleased to say that vision has become a reality. This fall, we will be opening our doors and welcoming some of the world's most gifted students who will be taught by an equally talented international faculty. In anticipation to our inaugural year, we have been hosting lecture events in New York that highlight principles important to NYU Abu Dhabi, among them the development of cultural institutions in the UAE. The lecture you will hear tonight by Hassan Khan is part of the lecture series Romanticide, Love, Loss, and Codependency in Art and Cultural Politics, which speaks to the current practice of contemporary art in the Middle East. I hope you will join us again when we host another lecture event on April 7th, which Clare will tell us about. Clare Davies has been our organizer for this event, and she has been able to bring to us an amazing number of lecturers, critics, curators, and artists. Clare is a doctoral candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts. Before coming to New York, she was an associate curator at the Townhouse Gallery of Contemporary Art in Cairo, where she curated the Open Studio Residency Program. Clare contributes regularly to Badoon magazine, and she just returned from Cairo, where she recently taught a 2-day seminar on contemporary art in Egypt at the Townhouse Gallery. Next month, she will help lead Badoon Project's art writing workshop series in Dubai, as well as participate as a panelist at Homeworks 5 in Beirut. And I'd like to turn this over to Clare.
Thank you, Kerry. Without Kerry's help, none of this would be possible, so thank you very much. And it's so embarrassing to hear introductions of your own, of yourself, but I'd like to point out that this is not me in the picture above, although it resembles me. It is not me. But the lecture series, or the series, is curated by me, and as we're sort of nearing the end of it, I thought I would just recap a little bit and perhaps a little more coherently about what was behind the idea for the series. When I was invited kindly to put this together last year, which seems like a long time ago, one issue struck me as especially urgent to address or relevant to within this context. Within the context of such an invitation, and also in the context of such an initiative as NYU Abu Dhabi in particular. This issue concerns a trend, I think a dominant one, in the context of cultural politics in the Middle East, in which humanitarian, non-governmental organizations, educational initiatives, nation-building initiatives draw on artistic practices to invest their own projects with a certain amount of intellectual currency. And I think this series it runs the risk of being considered an example of such a thing. And I think that of such a process, and this process romanticizes and mystifies institutions and artists alike. I think that romanticization might threaten to characterize an entire sphere of cultural production if it were not for the critical and lively engagement of many of the artists, curators, and publics that often are the driving force behind much of what is most interesting about what might be characterized as this sphere of cultural production and artistic practice. So in putting together this series, I wanted to invite some of those people whose work I admire most and who I felt were contributing a certain amount of self-reflexivity, a certain engagement with the way that artistic practice is folded into a certain cultural politics of institutions, of nation building, and invite those people to present themselves and their work and to speak in their own voices in the context of this series. The slightly idiosyncratic title, therefore, is a reflection of my preoccupation with this issue of romanticization. It might also be an effort to de-romanticize, which I think is something that's important, not necessarily only a negative gesture. I think that it might be something that's productive and extremely interesting and generates much needed conversation. And so it's on that basis that this series is sort of designed. Briefly, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, who is an artist, writer, and musician based in Cairo. Some of his solo shows include a show at the Gezira Art Center in Cairo in 1999, a show at Galerie Chantal Crucel in Paris in 2004, a Space Gallery in Toronto 2005, Gasworks London 2006. He also has a forthcoming exhibition at the Kunsthalle St. Gallen in this year, actually in May. Hassan has participated in various international group shows, including the Istanbul, Seville, Sydney, Thessaloniki, Contour, Guangzhou biennials, as well as the Turin and Yokohama triennials. He has composed soundtracks for theater. He regularly performs solo concerts, and his album Tabla Dub is available on the 100 Copies label. Khen is also widely published in both Arabic and English. His text, 9 Lessons Learned from Sharif al-Azma, was published by the Contemporary Image Collective, an organization based in Cairo, earlier this year. And as I mentioned, he lives and works in Cairo, Egypt. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce him, and welcome.
Okay. Thank you. I think before I start, thanks, Kerry, for this introduction, which I'm going to use as an example, very relevant to what I'm going to discuss today, which part of is about the relationship of the artist to the institution. So I'm glad that this was all framed within some kind of validation of the project of NYU Abu Dhabi, because it is an example of how artists somehow fit into a specific cultural landscape and are, in a sense, used to validate different cultural movements. My talk today is going to be, first of all, it's the first time I give this talk today. This is the premiere of this talk, and I want to do something that I've never done before. My talks are usually highly formalized, extremely tight, almost authoritarianly so. They're quite spectacular, if I may say so myself. However, in this talk, I want to be able to look at, or more accurately, sift through my own writings. So it's going to be quite dry, in a way, and not my works. I will not speak about any of my works, and the distinction is, for me, quite crucial. The aim is to trace the contours of a location, or maybe more accurately, the position through which I locate myself. Places that I maybe have been struggling with over the past 10 years, if not longer. It is my argument that maybe through this, it might be possible to get a sense of what I call here an argument. This is therefore an attempt at tracing a genealogy of propositions and statements. This is a completely self-reflexive genealogy, though. The only sources used here, the only citations I ever make, are from texts I have written and published over the past 10 years. So it's quite narcissistic. Unfortunately for you, although this is the first time I attempt to give that talk, it is not, as premieres usually are, I'm sorry to say, a spectacular affair. For the first thing I knew about this talk is that I wanted no evidence outside the textual. The second is that I wanted to keep my art practice far and distant. I knew from the very beginning that I did not want to show evidence or give examples. Here, I will not play you bits of music, no excerpts of no videos, no images. I could have shown you advertisements of a golf course on a billboard in Cairo, or a photograph of my friend Sharif Al-Azma hiding his face behind $10,000. I could have played you a hardcore Sha'bi track, but this I will not do. Even though I'm confident in many ways, it would communicate to you, the audience, with greater immediacy and efficiency, and might actually make this a more communicative affair. But the choice is strategic. I still find a deep necessity for someone in the position of an artist to not become a teacher in relation to the material they use, not to demonstrate, not to cite, and in this case, the decision to cite my own texts is part of an investigative practice. So, in a sense, this is an attempt at thinking out loud without the promise of results and ends. My relationship to the form of the lecture is quite extensive. Over the past 10 years, I've usually gone the whole way, in the sense that my previous lectures all used the medium of presentation itself. In a sense, they were practices that looked at their very own specificity as a source or as material to be used. So over the past decade, I've toured talks and lectures like What is the Difference Between the Cell and the Portrait, which is a talk accompanied by a video and a megaphone, or I Am Not What I Am, a time-coded, synchronized talk where I shuffle material, both visual and textual, a lecture that tries to speak of images but ends up being concerned with something else, where 9 notes are read out by an actor in relation to an archive of images being ordered and reordered in front of the audience. Figure and Ground, which wasn't actually performed live on the radio first, in where I read a text and play music in the style of Friday preachers, or 9 notes on Source, Process, and Product, where I also play music and read text accompanied by an animation piece. So this is not that. The challenge is to remain abstract, because it is, I believe at this point, and in this context specifically, an absolute necessity, while maintaining a sense of engagement. The only luxury I have permitted myself is something, again, that I've never really done before, the simplest and probably the most abused format for such presentations, the textual PowerPoint presentation. So that means I will project some quotes from different texts that have been written and published over the past decade. The challenge remains how to present an abstraction without evidence or examples and still remain engaging, to find a point of entry and a point of intersection. For my arguments over the years are many, from the vicious takedowns of the ethnographic, an understanding of the popular, of value and its relation to the specificity of art practice, of the artist's emotional economy, of friendship, and of cultural politics. It is the undisguised ambition of this talk to string all of these together, not to totalize them into one large meta-argument, but rather to trace or discover the contours of something, maybe to find out a new location. And to do this, as I've said already several times, without support of example or evidence. So let us begin then with words. Hysteria and ethnic marketing. This statement was made in the context of a text I had written in 2002 that was published in an edition of a journal published by the Migros Museum called Material. The issue was guest edited by Tirdad Zolgader, and the label Ethnic Marketing was both the title of the text and the title of that specific issue. The text, which was for me almost surprisingly so quite polemical in tenor, was an attempt at, in a quite vague fashion, to trace, the first attempt for me to trace the contours of a place from which I could speak as an artist. And this came at a point of time in my own biography where I had started moving around and exhibiting in different contexts. What that meant was, even then, a coming to terms with context in its widest forms. It was necessary for me to be engaged with what I will call here the first productive paradox of my career: the insistence on viewing my practice as a fully valid, independent, formal proposition, while at the very same time holding close to the understanding that a context, an economic reality, a set of relationships, an institutional framework, a discursive field were all absolutely significant in the formation of the statements I wish to propose. Thus, my sense of engagement was an understanding of art practice and the position of the artist as something quite clearly defined by that location. In this situation, this location is therefore a place in which my function as an artist is always reduced, is always limited, because it is, in this setting, a function as such. It is exactly that very practice of fixing, of assigning, that one paradoxically stands against in one's own practice, demanding a relation to the work unfettered by the demands of information and expectation. I will read a couple of paragraphs from that text to give a sense of where it's coming from. Normalization, or the logic of the hunter. The essentializing of identities is a necessary step in any socialization process. The power relations that govern the world, and within it, of course, the art world, a field as strategic as the military, are normalized by strategies that marginalize, patronize, deny, and contain the vibrant, living, and dangerous quality of a work. This is the logic of the geographical power, the logic of the hunter, the logic of the sensitive soul sitting there across the room and saying how wonderful Aboriginal art is. More insidious is the contemporary scene, which sells a certain illusion of inclusiveness, without revealing the way it constructs artists as trophies. All are exoticized. The local color added by the antics of this artist, the wonder promised by the ethnicity of that. The very presence of the artist as a subject within the work invariably lends it a certain aura, an aura that betrays a penchant for the dramatic. The narrative of the afflicted creator is necessary to lend pathos to the very mundane act of collecting, for quite high prices, the productions of contemporary culture. The elite insists on not allowing the contemporary art world to experience its very materiality directly. Hence, strategies of deferral, negotiated deals, grants, and foundations. Art will remain, like women in patriarchal societies, the storage house of the values of the race, the purity of the hybrid, the subtle reassessment of positions. End quote. Regardless of how much I would now, at this point of time, stand by some of these naive assertions made here, what I find important is the search for a way to frame the position of the artist in relation to the context he or she are operating in. To put this in relation to an understanding of what that means in terms of hiding how the work operates. So I will return to the text again to make this a bit more clear. Information is what you're supposed to present to the world. Therefore, the position you inhabit becomes one that provides information to the world about your identity and origins. The audience is thus not allowed to deal with your work on any other level. Engagement, the moment where both sides of the equation are involved in balanced and dangerous confrontations, is not possible. You have become essential, static, monolithic. The subject body here experiences a specific sense of time, an affliction, the insidious hysteria of restating yourself through a commercialized discourse determined by the need to provide information, to be allocated a space and not to be allowed to speak outside of it, to be a craftsman, to continuously respect technology, to live in the ruins of the nation state, to realize that you need nuclear weapons, to refuse nostalgia completely, to refuse the haunting of a constructed past, the seduction of turbans and flowing robes. Therefore, in this case, the process of normalization that is mentioned in the beginning is the transformation of the artist into the provider of information, a condition which produces a hysterical response. The practice seeks its own specificity in being undefined. The artist, in refusing to inhabit the position, the institution, assigns him, in a wider sense, leads to a certain structural conflict, and a conflict that is not to be resolved, in my opinion, a conflict that is to be mined for all what it's worth. So, hysteria is therefore a response, an active agency, and in some cases even a formal proposition. However, this is not to say that the work itself becomes hysterical or exhibits symptoms of hysteria, but rather that it is informed by an emotional charge related to that hysteria, to the unmanageable or to excess, especially in relation to this structural situation we found ourselves in, what I earlier referred to as a subtle form of exclusion that attempts to normalize both the artist and the artwork. However, what I love out of all of this is the title. So, I stop in front of this word and find it resonant, hysterical. Yet, a question is immediately put forth. Why does it resonate if the work one produces cannot in any way be described as hysterical? Yet, it remains resonant, an entry point to one's practice even if far from the controlled and modulated formal investigations one usually proposes. I sensed a contradiction under the surface, a contradiction between one's practice and what I sense lies behind that practice itself. So I therefore decided to attempt to follow up the implications of that word, to try to understand what that contradiction might mean, or if I was just sidestepping my own intentions as usual, avoiding them in the best possible way. In a sense, I was looking for where my fascination with the symptom betrays itself, out of my own imperfect authoritarian control over my own work. And thus, I return to the written text. So, I sifted again through texts published over the years and came across quite a few that dealt directly with popular Egyptian culture. And here we are definitely in the realm of the hysterical. So now I will fast forward to 2007, and I will discuss a text published in the failure issue of Bidoon magazine called Loud, Insistent, and Dumb. It's a text written about new wave Egyptian Shabi music. Shabi music is a popular urban music genre with overt class connotations, a local industry with large-scale informal distribution. It is a format that I have great respect for, a format that one finds is both wedded to its context, as it performs a clearly demarcated social and economic role, is consumed through industrial channels, yet it is a format that is able to propose highly innovative, formal developments in terms of both music and lyrics, and also in terms of what it means within the cultural landscape. So this is a form that does not claim a rupture to actually produce that formal innovation. That is, even though it labels itself like a lot of other products by including by aligning itself with the new, with the futuristic. So we would have an album called The Celebration of 2020, or The Simple and Literal, The Moulid of the New, for example. Even though it does that, it does that the way an industrial product would do that. It does not claim a rupture. So the label is always understood as a label of a product, not something else, not something more than that. And I think that's very important, a very important distinction. And I will explain why I'm referring to the popular to come back to something related to cultural politics. So it never, in a sense, it never attempts to locate itself. It gives itself an address that is based, it never gives itself an address that is based upon rupture, even if it is a rupture that it practices. That might be the very grounding of what popular culture, or at least one side of popular culture, could offer to us. In a sense, the hysterical within this genre is what allows the generic itself to be broken. without the need of making any claims about the act of breaking it. For it is exactly that hysterical excess that drives the formal innovation itself. Like in popular Egyptian comedy, at least since the 50s, where a form of literal pathological retardation is what fuels our laughter. The pathological is seen as funny, because the pathological is seen as funny, it is a way of doing many, many things. I mean, culturally, a way of doing many, many things that might not be possible otherwise. But it is not an act of subversion. It is not what critics would like to call it. It is something else. The act of rupture is therefore not glamorized and touted as an act of criticality, which is what happens in contemporary cultural practice all the time. Criticality becomes fetishized itself and becomes a form of value, exactly because it is hysterical and excessive. That is why it is impossible to glamorize that act of rupture, because its agenda is never defined, because its agenda maybe does not exist outside some kind of self-interest, some kind of self-serving attempt to find a space for a voice within a set of power relations. And everything that is more than that at the same time. Because, as I mentioned in my talk, I am not what I am, this is a functioning enigma. It is thus a space that cannot be reappropriated because it never claimed for itself a space outside the consensus in the first place, no matter how formally innovative or subversive the actual content was. So I'm going to quote from this article, Loud, Insistent, and Dumb. Hence, both pills and thrills are equally unreal, phantasms that exist within a self under stress, a self whose historical conditions were never on its side. Here I'm talking about, in this case, the self that I'm discussing is a class-connotated self, is the self within a specific place in contemporary Egyptian life. However, I'd like to use that same statement and through a simple act of transference to the position of the artist, forced to define his or herself outside the specificity of their own practice. And then we find that self under stress all the time. In this space beyond meaning and categories, there exists an unknowable surplus, a core that lies undefined, a quantity beyond measurement. Yet this seeming transcendental surplus can only be enacted in daily life, in the culture we produce and consume. It is both surface and depth. If airbrushed pop can only present us with glossy escapist fantasies, a fleeting 3-minute daydream best encapsulated in video clips blaring out of TV sets before returning to the trappings of a failed society, then Sha'biyat is a more material struggle with the surplus of that urban condition, a coming to terms with it that leads to the violent desire to claim power over the social space, desire that can only be purged by the production of new pleasures. This is that crystal hard space in a social system where irrationality and neurosis can function as valid drives, rather than being categorized as guilt-ridden sublimations of lived conditions. Therefore, what is perverse in mainstream media, the eroticism of a child's voice, for example, is here no longer perverse. Taboos aren't broken, but relocated. The taboo has finally become totem. Now, what's incredibly interesting for me here is that idea, the possibility of the taboo, which in a sense here stands for the object of critique, becoming a totem. This is a new and surprising twist, a new relationship which potentially allows for an understanding of artistic practice. And a lot of the artworks demanded by the mainstream art circuit, informed in part, and as always in a slightly embarrassed fashion, by the present international regional power relations, the taboo is the object of critique, the obsessive focus of, in quotation marks, the critical and therefore secretly either cynical or neurotic artist. What's productive in ceasing to find the taboo as our focus is that the work becomes much more resistant to, on one level, explanations and easy And on another level, the easy fascination with a fetish, with a very specific fetish. For the focus on breaking taboos immediately brings us in the presence of the fetish, the marks of the critical operation, stylistically different in each work, becomes fetishized as signs of quality of the work. To discuss the shift to totem, I would like to refer to an earlier conversation where the totem was discussed in relation to a work called Stuffed Pig Follies. The discussion is also used in the lecture, I Am Not What I Am. So in Stuffed Pig Follies, we're discussing the figure of a pig. And it says, the pig is anthropomorphized all the time. That's where my interest comes from, the way a culture speaks through what I will call totems. We then discuss an image of a porcelain pig in a hotel breakfast room that was used to symbolize ham cutlets. I will go back to the text. Because the totem, in that case, represents what we are going to consume through its affinity to what's human, it paradoxically brings out the very distance and difference that lies between an inside and an outside, i.e. between what's human and what's not, what's alive and what's dead. I would argue that the investment of an imaginary animating power associated with the understanding of the totemic places it at a distance from the fetish, which is always obsessed with a consuming, obsessive and deadly focus. And I would like to underline the word deadly here. Let us go a bit further then, if we are to reference the distance between an outside and an inside. It's also about, and here I will quote again from that same discussion, it's about the possibility of an other that lies outside and is to be ingested and consumed. It is about a space that lies between the subjective I and the object of one's understanding, or lust. The very presence of difference implies a set of limits and units, an idea of who we are. I tend to use the term possession here in the sense of an imaginary animating force, to also refer to and speak about the conditions that are necessary for a social self to come into being. This idea of possession is actually a daily cultural operation. It is our acceptance of the imaginary in our visual landscape. It is where a pig can speak, or a 3D cartoon character can sell you toothpaste. These are thus normalized practices of possession in service of commerce and social order. And then I would like to go back to the talk to speak about this word normalized again. The normalized practices of possession functions as one layer in the formalization of a highly personal experience. So the reference I'm using in this case in Stuffed Pig Follies, which is something like a Disney pig, is already symbolic of a cultural operation. In this case, we're using a general reference in a highly personal fashion. And through that use, allowing a form, an actual form, to establish itself. In a sense, we learn something about how our imaginary operates from the generic that lies outside us. And then we allow these deep structures to discover or acquire a form, a kind of logic. So, therefore, in a situation like that, where a form is always both a reference to a generic set of conditions and a personal investment, or an engagement at the very same time, there is no place for loss. There is no place for nostalgia, for example. This is the space where the subjective self can speak, as if it's unique and alone. And only anxiety is possible, because coexistence, hence dialogue, is always at one level a form of anxiety. I'd like to take that point, this kind of the moment where loss or a sense of loss or nostalgia is not possible, and go back to my discussion of new wave shabby music, because one finds surprising points of intersection. At another point in that same article, a description of the effect and impact of this genre upon the popular sphere is described. And it is exactly that that makes this cultural form, at least for me, a highly radical and promising format. So I'm quoting again. Maybe Cairo is finally waking up to the loss of pathos and emotions, laments and wounded machismo. Here there is no sympathy and no redemption anymore. Here they are as hard as nails. Although we might still shed tears about the cruel world, double-crossing lovers, and the betrayal of friends, somewhere between the pounding drum machine and that insistent radical synth riff, there is no space for real lament. There is no claim to authenticity. Only self-conscious performative gestures. In short, a simulation. i.e., that format presents us with the possibility of sidestepping the argument around authenticity and origins, that corrupt argument around authenticity and origins that so dominated the earlier model in which the artist serves the information industry. That same industry whose foundations lie in sociology, anthropology, and their relation to the colonial project in general. To repeat for emphasis, that movement is only possible in the transformation of taboo, of what I earlier called taboo as this idea of the object of critique, into totem, which is something completely different. In this specific example, a response is possible from the collective. And I don't want to romanticize the collective here. And therefore, I would like to emphasize that this is not a populist fascination with the popular and the collective as much as it's an attempt at understanding what one can formally learn through an analysis. This is an analysis that is not based upon a rationalist and telic breakdown of constitutive elements, but rather an artist's engagement with his own sources as a form in itself. And that has to, in some way or another, remain also mysterious. So we call forth the collective and their productions to learn from them. But this is not any collective. These are not the ill-fitted peasant soldiers of central security stomping their boots before beating the shit out of a group of bourgeois demonstrators. Neither is it the crowd in the football stadium demanding a victim and burning a flag. This is the collective that I will call here, or that I will here call the crowd. The word crowd has a long history in my practice. It appears in 17 and in AUC, which is a book project that I will quote from a bit later. And it first appears again in ethnic marketing, this earlier kind of clumsy text. And I will quote here, "A lesson learned on the streets of Cairo. The crushed body in the metro or the bus moving through the often condensed streets of the city creates a new experience of the self. This is a space where citizens' inspection of each other becomes a sign of familiarization, a communal denial of the exotic. On public transportation, the Cairean body tastes its fellow occupants and feels them up close in a series of half-negotiated movements. A public gratification of the desire for the stranger that all big cities breed in its inhabitants is assuaged. Violation is mutual and the exotic is again banished beyond the class border. It becomes necessary in cities where all are starved for power to publicly display the signs of their acquisitions." So I'm here clearly suffering from the enthusiasm of a younger self, of the university graduate's fascination with collective codes of power, from romanticism, from the image of nostalgia. But then, here it is again, in the last text I just finished, called In Defense of the Corrupt Intellectual, which is included in How to Begin Envisioning the Impact of Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, a thesis project organized by Ozge Orsoy at the Center for Curatorial Studies, Barrett College. So, full circle, and we are back here. So, the word density that is in this quotation here, the word density here is quite significant and is used to refer to two distinct modes. On one level, the heavy and tired legacy of failed discourses from, for example, socialist, pan-Arab, Marxist, Islamist Marxist, and the same old tired list goes on, and their practice in different forms, both as state power or the consensus of dissent. And on the other hand, an adjective used, this is the word density again, an adjective used to describe the depth of the group of individual citizens walking down the streets of the city, transformed by proximity and the very rules of their landscape into what I will call here the crowd. So what does that density and depth mean exactly? Basically, what I'm trying to point to here is the way a collective mass of individuals subscribing to a shared public discourse, a set of codes, an understanding of communication becomes unified into a meta-organ that possesses its own aura. I maybe need to go back to 17 and AUC to remember a specific incident. 17 AUC is a published book that is composed of the unedited transcriptions of an action where I constructed a one-way mirrored soundproofed room where people could see and hear me while I was totally isolated, and sat in it for 4 hours every night for 14 nights, speaking, smoking cigarettes, drinking beer. What I spoke about was guided by 3 rules. I could only speak about my direct memories as an undergraduate student at the American University in Cairo between 1990 and 1995. I could only theoretically reflect upon both the memories and the institution, and I could only reflect on the present situation I was in then. So I will quote from these transcriptions, because it is kind of where this idea of a crowd first shows up. From page 4, and then go to Meydan Ramses and go off and walk all the way to AUC because I have a class at 8. The thing is, Meydan Ramses at 7:15 or 7:30 in the morning, it's like rush hour, basically. And I had many different experiences at that time. In that place, I used to get off the bus, and it's fucking busy. A lot of people, sometimes human beings, people, and ecstasy, some kind of deep connection. All people around me till I reach the university. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's attacking me. Sometimes it's complete paranoia. Sometimes it's like a thousand people who are enemies in a way at any point, at any time, because they're human, you're human, and that's part of what it is. It is the enemy that we face, and we know is an enemy because you're being an enemy to yourself too. Because you have to, because you understand that this is just what it is. This is just sensitivity to what you're revealing to yourself. You're equally aggressive yourself and defensive. So it was moving from the mass of this place and the people from everywhere. It was a great happening. Lots of people gathered together early in the morning in the same place, and they create something by moving to and fro. By moving, they're creating something. So, further on, I want to understand in a wider way what it meant, this paranoia. What is it? It's a question. I'm not sure it was it connected to the fact that, for example, I went down in a place where everybody meets, like Meydan Ramses, and everybody was part of something bigger in a way, with all of the aggression of that inside. I went from a place like that to the isolated individual. And maybe part of this paranoia was connected to the mood from this huge lust of people. So the description of my memory of experiencing the crowd here gives us a few points of entry. The seething mass is composed of a basic contradiction between the aware individual, who is both seduced and resistant to that formation, as well as a sense of paranoid possibility. Let us look at another example or observation from Figure and Ground, which was a live radio broadcast in which I, as I mentioned earlier, assumed the voice of Friday preachers while performing music and reciting these texts. And here I quote, "One day I chose to see everything as a broadcast, a specific broadcast, a specific quality, a specific quantity. One day in the subway in Berlin, land of hundreds of lakes and illusions, we stop for 1 beat longer, 1 second that could have been 1 minute or 1 hour, we stop for 5 minutes. Someone moves their head, looks away into the distance, the train has stopped. They look away as if they cannot see what is around them, as if they have become transported somewhere else. She looks away, a young woman in Berlin. Only when the train moves, when function returns, when the city speaks back to her, when her rights, what are these rights, are returned to her, is she willing to go back to her book and participate in the sphere of mortality again, to become one of many divided subjects again. In this case, a woman on the subway in Berlin refuses to read her book, refuses to partake, to belong, to be identifiable the moment function ceases, the moment the subway stops, when the rules of the collective contract are in a sense broken. Now, keeping both these descriptions in mind, and they're quite different, let us return to our discussion of the crowd in the context of the defense of the corrupt intellectual. So, that crowd is the other to that legacy, the legacy that I mentioned earlier, the legacy of both state power and dissent, while serving as the source through which these discourses gain legitimacy. These discourses being that legacy itself. The process of legitimization always increases the distance between discourse and subject. It increases this distance because it formalizes the relationship and creates a protocol through which that relationship is regulated. So in a sense, it is the production of a dichotomy that produces a distance. Therefore, we can posit that crowd as an absolute other to both state and dissent, both who claim to speak that crowd. The crowd is where a seething mass with a unified understanding of its own presence, as well as a conglomeration of frictions, tensions, and fictions, manages to resolve themselves into an identifiable entity. Now that form of density is never possible in engineered successful spaces, from the progressive museum to the commercial marketplace. So in this case, I'm discussing an art context specifically. The projected success, the suspended future it grounds its activities upon. The very functionality of the space cancels out the possibility of that crowd forming itself, or to be more precise, emerging. So this functionality is the very same one that posits the artist as a carrier of information. It is important here to refer back to one of the specificities of contemporary cultural practice, or maybe even institutional politics, which is its constant attempts at building a parasitic relationship to that entity, the crowd in that sense, unified and dramatic, collective and lonely. In this relationship, the density is used to signify the relevance of the abstracted spaces of cultural reflection to the social sphere they claim to serve. So by representing, in a way, what I will by extension call the crowd, an argument of legitimacy is made by the institution. And this, I think, is more and more visible because the nature of art institutions have changed. The way they have changed, this becomes more and more visible. I will now skip a couple of paragraphs that discuss the corrupt intellectual because it's not relevant for this argument, and come to the following remarks. What it can never be in this case, what it can never be is an expression of a purely liberated liberal subjectivity. The free and informed museum visitor, art history student, or seeker of knowledge and refined experiences is never really possible beyond the machinations of PR departments and marketing strategies. The corrupt intellectual is thus here to remind us, to balance, to tragically be a history, as well as serving those very departments as the target of propaganda disguised as critique. For maybe the central conflict in the field of artistic practice is not the one that is always sold to us between the critical, politically committed versus the commercially driven and decorative, but rather between understanding the practice of art as a nexus in which artworks, references, and meanings are unhinged, while simultaneously and paradoxically an acceptance of the expanded context that always assigns meanings is practiced. That is on one hand. So on one hand, we have something that is quite contradictory. It's a place where we understand art practice as a meeting point between something that is completely unhinged, where all its references are liminal, yet at the same time operates within a very, very concrete, imminent situation, which is what I also mentioned earlier. That's on one hand. On the others, versus the space where all different elements, from artist to institution to artwork, are instrumentalized. So this is the conflict I'm proposing, instead of the critical, politically committed artist versus the commercially driven one. In this example, there was a conscious and concerted attempt at finding a handle through which to practice a form of cultural politics, while maintaining a formalist understanding of the artwork. The formalism we speak of here is deeply related to treating the artwork as an unhinged, again, sign, one that refers and signifies, yet whose reference and signifieds are at best liminal and ambiguous. However, as always, there is an inability to ignore the trappings of the context in their most reduced and unsentimental nature, i.e. the institution's presence. For the implicit critique being posed to the institution here is related to the way we understand what knowledge is. Funnily enough, this paragraph is lifted from a text that was a critical analysis of the Documenta magazine project. In a way, I felt that it kind of maybe lays down the ground for an understanding of what the institution is. And I will quote from that text. This text is called "Abandon the Dialectic, My Son." So, to constitute a field of knowledge, a space where we speak of culture, then all elements will, regardless of their specificity, be held to an absolute measure. That measure is the discursive field. It is what allows the voice to speak meaning in the first place. This is an absolute only in terms of defining what we can speak about. Content is here not important. It is rather the existence of that structure that is of political significance, which is why exclusion or inclusion was never the real question, but rather the idea of specific limits and how they were formed. So in a sense, the discussion around exclusion and inclusion, which is again one that is constantly hashed and rehashed again, is almost like a red herring. The demands for rights is now where we should be, is not where we should be looking for our arguments, but rather as artists who are in a sense highly privileged, it might be our imperative to shift that discussion and to never ask, but to always demand, to be in a sense difficult. But I will take this up in my discussion, my final discussion of the artist's emotional economy. Let us return to the text at hand. So what do we have in the institution's very own self-presentation? And I quote again from the text: "What is truly problematic is refusing to acknowledge the activities of this operation, mystifying its structure rather than defending its measures. We are therefore left with a dichotomy that insists on viewing activity, production, and yes, even agency through the prism of suspended ends and utopic progression, so enamored by the apologists of historical modernity. This is the logic of pyramids and podiums, whose potency derives from a power that both organizes and haunts, a power that possesses both the mysticism of unspoken enigmas and the authority of the objective and the consensual." And I mean, I think this paragraph doesn't say much more than what is usually repeated, except that it adds, I think, what is sometimes overlooked, the idea of the mystifying power that haunts, that the institution also possesses, not only its rational side. I.e., the institution is the organizing structure that mystifies how and why the field of knowledge is brought into play. And at least in this description is an entity that inhabits a similar paradox as the artwork. For it organizes, which is a function that is absolutely clear and transparent and comprehensible, and by the way, has been discussed to death, yet it is also an entity that haunts a much less discussed area, which is where the situation becomes a bit more complicated. The problem is that the haunting of the institution is rarely discussed. The aura of that space, that context, the kind of desires it produces in its members and those who engage with it, from employees to audiences to the artist. For the artist here is, as always, both the ultimate member of that institution as well as the arbitrator of its very presence. For the artist is, in one of his or her aspects, the ultimate proletarian, he whose labors and productions is what directly extends value, not to the institution only, but to the whole field. So he is also the proletarian whose capital is not only their labor, but their labor, but their very own being. This is not meant in any kind of essentialist romantic understandings of the artist, but rather as a simple and long overdue recognition of what kind of understanding, of what kind of conditions artists operate under. So I think that I will move now to a final point about the emotional economy of the artist, and I refer here to a text that was published in Eflux Journal called Rant. This was a text that on its surface was a sort of gloss or exegesis of a video that had the same title that was produced for a show called Lapdogs of the Bourgeoisie, which was a touring project that took upon it as one of its central focuses the relationship between the artist and class. So I would like to maybe quote a point. Rant was composed of 9 points, and I will quote one. How do we survive the poisoned glance, the uncomfortable handshakes, the innuendos of undeserved arrogance? We might recognize that introverted scenes produce bile and hysterical defensiveness, yet we remain unable to discover alternatives. This is not that alternative, but only the chance to go into free fall. We begin with a scene at the end of its limits, a scene unable to go beyond the sound of its own insecure, high-pitched, neurotic voice, a scene on the brink of implosion. The members of the scene are stuck between a craving for validation and approval and the fallout that accompanies unrequited desires. The individuals belonging to this group have to live off two systems at the same time, all further complicated by the specificity of the scene's own demand for validation. And thus we get the hustlers and liars who all want a piece of the cake, those willing to market their backgrounds to the 9th degree, to the lazy, smug, self-satisfied arrogance of an international counterpart that is still not able to come to terms with what the flow of information really means. That's note 1b. In note 2b, this scene that is described is connected to the emotional life of the members of that set. So in the scene, personal relationships are self-righteously confused with professional ones. Every participant is placed under the regime of a moral conformity in which the gestures of political engagement and high-level personal bickerings become more or less the same thing. A demand is therefore made on every participant, every unwitting masochist, to perform the rituals of allegiance to the master order of the set. And finally, just to close it up, the relation to aesthetics, to an actual aesthetic practice is made. And the question is asked, but more importantly, what kind of aesthetic choices do these conditions lead to? Something must be fetishized. And in this case, the easiest target is the softest one. Thus, the downtown cosmopolitanism of the hustler, the obsession with the nostalgic chandelier, the superficial binaries of the contemporary and the authentic, and most of all, the insistence that contradictions exist. These are all maladies related to this condition. So the question of practice is raised. How can the artist from that position find a voice to speak from? One that maintains the work's absolute independence and validity and unfixedness while coming to terms with the artist's very own grounding in an immediate context that is being described here. Maybe a return to the work is proposed. However, the return to the work is not as simple a proposal as it demands. I mean, in a sense, it is easy to write a return to the work, but it demands an actual operation, which is not possible only from the artist's side. So, all of this, in a sense, I mean, this kind of trawled through all these texts and kind of laid out in a wide network of references with words like hysteria or resolution or value, takes us in the end to a discussion of the image of the artist in the work itself. And this is also another kind of heavy theoretical discussion, which would entail citing from my MA thesis, which is something I definitely don't want to do. So one can also and very productively return to the earlier discussions of fetish, totem, and taboo. One might also return to the institution, the site of the struggle, if you will. So I will quote finally from a text that was written last year called A Simple Turn. My argument is simple, or maybe it can be simply put. The institution is a location where the process of normalization is constantly at play. The institution is the educational agent, the source of civilization. It is this process through which the institution can come to know of itself. Turns are a structural demand of an industry, which this institution is a member of. The turn, whether a noun or a verb, will always lead to a reappropriation of the conditions of the past, while claiming radical breaks. That is because the turn is merely a fetishized gesture rather than an actual attempt at motion. The turn helps produce value in an industry where the relationship between product and value has to remain unfixed, while the structure and hierarchies remain intact. The artist operating under these conditions has limited choices, either an acquiescence to the producers of fetish or a meaningless narcissistic resistance that ultimately fetishizes the figure of the artist himself. So torn between these conflicting drives, the artist is forced to discover his or her anger and to maybe consider it as a starting point. It is maybe this anger as a response to the industry, both in its institutional and curatorial guises, that the artist might find the possibility of fashioning a subject position that is in turn sensitive to the relationship of a fluctuating, unfixed value in a hierarchical market. Or, in other words, if we are to accept, let us accept knowing fully well what it is we actually accept. A question arises. It is a matter of knowing what one is implicated in exactly, in realizing that the fetish can never be possessed and is thus always dead. It is maybe apt to end with a final, extremely short quote from In Defense of the Corrupt Intellectual. And that's it. And we can have a Q&A.
What do you see, do you see that there being a different kind of role for the institution? One that you would find more interesting or wouldn't necessarily fall with it, or is it just sort of a blanket position that every institution must occupy as an artist?
In a way, obviously not, because things do happen. However, my points are also a bit about structure. They're a bit about what kind of structure lies behind the institution. So it's not really the institution itself or how it wishes to present itself that is the problem. It's more what kind of limits are being put behind that. Yes, I think it's possible, but I still do believe, no matter what, it is the artist's responsibility to maintain that difficulty and to complicate that relationship constantly. Because the moment we celebrate the institution as being progressive or whatever it is, even if it's a wonderful, successful institution, the moment this happens, you're involved in a validation that is not your. That is in a way a betrayal of your own position. That's at least from my perspective. So yes, I think it's possible, but I believe that the counterpart has to remain always difficult.
Then how is that? How does one avoid? We were also indicting the fetishization of criticality.
Yes.
So I'm curious how you square that prescription with your warning, your caution.
With my practice here.
Yeah.
Yes,
which is to say that does this position that you're describing, that you just described in response to Clare, constitute this? Does that lie at the center of one's practice, or is it understood to be a necessary condition of a practice which is otherwise defined? If it's otherwise defined, then it's hard for me to I'm trying to imagine how one can do both at the same time.
Yes. Well, I think that, first of all, there's an insistence on specificity. So, for example, when I stand here, and that's why I also refuse to show any images, etc. in this context. There is a very rigid insistence on specificity, and therefore in a situation where a certain discursive practice which has a clearly identified function and label, in a sense, that is accepted by the artist, in this case, this criticality, I would argue, is not fetishized, because it's operating within the circuit where it is supposed to operate, in a way. However, when you come to the artwork, and the artwork becomes subsumed by the claims of criticality, and where its value is acquired by that position, you immediately enter, I think, a different realm. And I think that's where the danger is. So the danger is not in critical thought. It's in the confusion that occurs between the specificity of art practice and critical thought. Yes.
There was a point in the argument that I hope you can go back to, where you spoke about how, I think it was turning a point into a form is what prevents the possibility of loss of understanding.
Turning to what, sorry?
That's what I'm hoping you can go back to. There was a point where you said to take this and turn it itself into a form prevents loss, prevents nostalgia.
Yes.
And so my question is if you could go back to that and open up that process.
Yeah. Let me look at it.
When it comes to how, is it for the child?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I know what you're referring to. Yeah. Yes. So I was speaking. Well, I was speaking about the possibility of a formalism, in a sense, even a formalism that remains relevant and remains charged because it is in touch with how the generic, which is around us, is also part of our own sources and our own imaginary. So it is not like pop art where you're demonstrating an appropriation of what is there, but it's rather a process in which you find the resonances of all that is popular or generic, or what is the contours of mainstream culture, if you want. You find their resonances in your own imagination or your own imaginary, and you operate with that, you work with that. I was drawing this in parallel to something like Shabi music, which is a popular form that is radical also formally. What it does with the music is quite radical at points, etc. But it does that without the self-consciousness of claims. Not without the self-consciousness of being an artist, but without the self-consciousness of claiming a radical rupture, for example. Because it is in touch with this kind of, because it's because it does not see the generic as generic, because it treats it as material.
But it doesn't see the generic at all. There's no distance between it.
But I would argue there is, because a form is actually produced. A form that is in this case a musical form. So in this case it's a musical form. And the difference, I see your point. The difference between both is that, if there is no distance at all, then you're not even replicating. You are that generic condition. However, in this case, I'm saying it's informed by it without quoting it, in a sense. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's a place where irony, for example, is not really valid anymore, you know, actually. Irony in a sense is not really valid anymore in a space like that. But that doesn't mean that there is no distance. There can be a distance that is different. It's a distance that maybe doesn't, you know, let me say, it's easy to have a certain type of distance that just resolves everything and clearly assigns a position for you, for the work, and for the audience, for example, in which we can share or differ about. But it's maybe more conflicted and more difficult to find a space where that distance is there, but it's not possible to describe. That's why I say irony is not possible anymore, because irony is a description of that distance in that case.
This is why I would have asked for whom, because to me, this is the possibility of you are describing this that creates what's happening. To me, it seems like.
Right.
For you, there is a generic that is being processed.
Yes, in this analysis.
Without criticality.
In this analysis, yes.
Then against it, you said something else which has the critical edge, I guess. So,
For whom?
do you distinguish?
Yeah, for whom, again, I would go back to this idea of specificity. And I think that specificity it really depends on what you're doing in that case. That is what gives you a sense of for whom it is exactly, you know? And that's what would make a difference between someone giving a talk, someone writing a lecture, someone producing an artwork, or someone just running down the streets and screaming, for example. I mean, that is maybe where that difference could be drawn. I don't know if
For whom is your argument?
yeah, I'm saying that for whom is always relevant to the specificity of what you're doing, you know? Where does it circulate? What is its, where is it being put, in what context, in what framework? And that kind of at least gives us a sense of for whom, you know, if it doesn't fix it completely.
Curation or directorial funding, I didn't hear you.
I didn't, yes. That's another discussion. Yes, I mean, first of all, this is very schematic also, you know, so it doesn't aim or claim to be exhaustive in any way. It is merely an associative journey. And so in that specific associative journey, we did not touch that figure.
Obviously, you have some information about it, and
Experiences. Yes. We have long experiences. Yeah. I mean, it's part of the landscape, and it's part of the kind of relationship you wish to build. I mean, again, I think that maybe one kind of point that I keep returning to is how a relationship is built in the first place, and where does, you know, what kind of claims does the artist make in that relationship? And I think that's valid also in relation to a curator, for example. I think whether it's an institution or a curator, I think that same attitude is valid.